If you think about the mental health and clinical and spiritual needs of Muslims, where were the spaces that they had available to talk about their relationship issues, their identity issues, their depressions, their anxieties, in a way that integrated and made central and brought to the forefront their religious identities, psychological well-being. It's really intricately tied to spiritual health and spiritual well-being. If an individual is making a conscious and deliberate attempt to ensure that they are present in their daily salawat, they're engaged in their adhkar, they're working on their inner self and their akhlaq, trying to increase their sense of self-awareness, and they create a schedule and time frame for themselves in which they break away to do these things. One of the things that I like to prescribe is khalwa time, essentially seclusion, breaking off. In modern psychology, they sort of give you this mindfulness remedies that are derived from Buddhism, but we have our own sort of tafakkur and contemplative exercises, muraqabah.
Before we begin the podcast, a quick message from our sponsor. If you're Muslim and you care about your money, download this right now, the Halal Money app. An incredibly well-designed and easy-to-use financial app that allows you to open an account, deposit money, and spend through a Visa debit card they give you to use in your everyday transactions, away from the hands of a bank that's reveling in interest and even using your money in haram places. Download it now.
Dr. Hooman Keshavarzi is a licensed clinical psychologist and an expert in the integration of Islamic spirituality and mental health. He serves as the program director for the Masters in Counseling Islamic Psychology program in Doha, Qatar. He's a visiting scholar at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul and is the founding director of Khalil Center, the largest provider of Muslim mental health care in North America. He has published research on Islamic psychology and delivers international lectures on faith-based mental health wellness. His unique approach bridges traditional Islamic wisdom with modern psychology, making his insights particularly valuable for navigating spiritual growth and emotional well-being for Muslims around the world. Dr. Hooman, all the way from Chicago, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to our studio at OnePath Network in Sydney, Australia. It's great to have you here in Sydney for the first time.
Yeah, the honor is all mine. MashaAllah, happy to be here in Sydney.
Alhamdulillah. Did you enjoy coming to our studio for the first time?
Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you.
An incredible setup you all have here, mashallah. Just pleasantly surprised with the establishment and rootedness of the Muslim community here. Australian Muslim community.
I'm sure we can take many learnings from those abroad in the United States of America. MashaAllah. Especially I'm hearing that Khalil Center is the largest mental health care provider for Muslims in North America. Yeah. That's really incredible. Mm-hmm. But if I could, take you back a few years, inshallah, what made you pursue a career in psychology and then in turn Islamic psychology? Where did it all begin? Walk us through it.
Yeah. I think I can say that this probably happened while I was doing my bachelor's at the University of Toronto. I went to the United States to do my graduate studies later on. Mm-hmm. And during my studies, I think like many of us had sort of late high school, during my bachelor's, had sort of a spiritual awakening. Many of us were, Muslims growing up in the West, may have a sort of cultural affiliation with Islam, but we need to have what I like to call like a personal conversion experience, and a need to sort of ask the question of why we're Muslims. And that took me down a journey of self-exploration and trying to figure out who I am. And that aligned with also just my interest in psychology and human beings, generally more of a social person. And so I just went down the path of studying psychology while I was trying to further my Islamic learning. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I quickly realized while I was doing my studies in psychology is that how much of the Muslim tradition is absent in the sort of Western secular academia. And that's where my interest started to begin. I started to think about, and meanwhile, I'm, attending like durus and halaqat and all of these, majalis of ilm and whatnot, and spirituality. And we're reading about, the works of, Ghazali and Suhrawardi and all these other mashayikh, and we're going through their works, and they're discussing the self. how to better the self, how to achieve contentment, how to transform yourself, how to make yourself a better person for this dunya and the akhirah. And none of these names are being mentioned, and there's so much overlap between the topics and subjects that we're studying in psychology and this. So I, started to do a little bit of a survey of what's out there. I said, there's got to be some people that's writing about this. I stumbled upon Dr. Malik Badri, but outside of him, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was doing this early work, and some other notable early individuals that were trying to sort of make space or introduce the idea of an Islamic psychology or the importance of the Islamic intellectual heritage in the field of psychology, there wasn't a lot, especially by way of resources or practical models or applications. And that's where I felt like this is an area that I might want to try to contribute to. And I never imagined that it would really take off to be this far, to be honest. Alhamdulillah, I pray that Allah Ta'ala accept it and not make it, forgive the shortcomings that we have. But I realized that I was tapping into eventually an incredible demand and need. Like I wasn't the only person thinking about this. Even if you think about the mental health and clinical and spiritual needs of Muslims, where were the spaces that they had available to talk about their relationship issues, their identity issues, their depressions, their anxieties, in a way that integrated and made central and brought to the forefront their religious identities. How we make meaning and derive purpose and understand ourselves and our worlds around us is informed by our worldviews, perspectives, our values and beliefs.
I guess you have like this influx of Muslims that are suffering from mental health only going to non-Muslim therapists that don't understand, the cultural literacy or the sensitivities that we may have. And also all this extensive knowledge that we have in our own tradition that we need to start extrapolating, using in our therapy, inshallah. That's incredible. An icebreaker for yourself. I think there's this whole concept of a mental health routine. People like to plaster them on their social media. This is my mental health routine. Do you have your own mental health routine? And if so, can you share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about a mental health routine as much as I think maybe some of the topics we'll get into throughout the podcast is this idea of psychological well-being or contentment. And if we sort of survey that within the Islamic intellectual heritage, it's really intricately tied to spiritual health and spiritual well-being. So if an individual is making a conscious and deliberate attempt to ensure that they are present in their, daily salawat, they're engaged in their adhkar, they're working on their inner self and their akhlaq, trying to increase their sense of self-awareness, and they create a schedule and time frame for themselves in which they break away to do these things. One of the things that I like to prescribe is khalwa time. Khalwa, to essentially seclusion, breaking off. In modern psychology, they sort of give you this mindfulness, remedies that are derived from Buddhism, but we have our own sort of tafakkur and contemplative exercises, muraqabah, in which an individual can break away from the hustle of everything to spend, 2 to 5 minutes to start just focusing on just doing some dhikr and trying to be as mindful as possible without having this scattered brain. Our minds kind of racing and going everywhere with all of our different thoughts. I think those things can be really important. So I actually like to think of it as spiritual hygiene. We think about, physical hygiene. And if you keep your physical health in check, then it'll affect your mental health, right? You're exercising, you're not getting your vitamin D, it's going to affect your mental health. What about your spiritual hygiene, right? And if we bring those together, then I think that, resiliency can definitely be engendered.
Understanding from what you're saying is that there's a huge correlation between one's religious practice and their mental health well-being. On this topic, there's a famous study that I like to reference a lot, and I can get it cross-checked with yourself. But basically, there's a study that was conducted in Germany, in Mannheim University, which set out to determine what were the biggest single contributing factors towards determining one's level of contentment in life. And they basically determined after a sample size of 67,000 people. So after sampling over 67,000 people, they determined that those who held beliefs of oneness had the highest level of contentment. And when she looked further, she realized that the highest category on that list of people that experience contentment were Muslims. And she realized at the very bottom of the list were people who had no religion, atheists, and they didn't have any sense of or any experience of oneness. Therefore, they didn't experience the same level of contentment that Muslims were experiencing. So basically, off this study that we've spoken about, and off of your mental health routine, which is so intertwined with, practicing Islam.
Yes.
How does Islam influence and affect someone's contentment in life?
Yeah, no, very good, mashallah. And I'm learning something from you. Sorry, I've as I mentioned to you before, I have this lingering cough from the travel. But yeah, no, absolutely. Jazakallah khair for sharing that. Actually, I'm not familiar with it myself. So if you can share that would be wonderful. I'd love to take a look at it. But if we kind of look at this idea of contentment and notion of psychological well-being, why don't we sort of interrogate it maybe from just a pure Islamic perspective, and then we sort of look at what the psychological literature says and look at the overlap. The Quran says, "Man amila salihan min dhakarin aw untha, wa huwa mu'minun, falanuhyiyannahu hayatan tayyibah." Whomsoever does righteous deeds, male or female, and they believe in Allah Ta'ala, they're a believer, then we shall give them the good life, the pure life, the wholesome life. Now, I want us, and this is something that I have a mission to popularize. I want us to start to use for psychological well-being the term hayatan tayyibah, because there's a lot of concepts that get muddled when we use English terms or modern terms because they're filled with a lot of the philosophies and the underpinnings and assumptions of other traditions. When we use these Quranic concepts, they are filled with certain meanings that get lost when you translate them. So for psychological well-being, I think we should start to use the term hayatan tayyibah because it's intricately tied to spirituality and belief in Allah Ta'ala. But one of the most common tafsirs, interpretations of hayatan tayyibah is qana'ah, is a sense of contentment. What is the good life? The good life is one in which an individual feels content. And psychological literature today kind of looks at the difference between pleasure, is more they call like hedonic pleasure, hedonistic pleasure, which is temporary, short-lived, eating something sweet, having a thrill for a particular more sensational, joys, compared to that which is long-standing and more permanent and a permanency. And that's what they kind of call more of the contentment, right? Or true happiness. And so contentment is Allah Ta'ala is showing us and demonstrating to us that there is an important relationship between spiritual acts and spirituality. That's why I said, if you protect your spirituality, it will help you protect your mental health. And people who tend to be more spiritual, who engage in spiritual acts and believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believe in God, they tend to be more resilient against psychological distress. It serves as a protective factor against mental illness. It increases their sense of well-being, their resilience, their relationships. Positive psychology has started to move in the direction of looking at virtues. So what they're saying is that, look, the absence of mental disorder, mental illness, is not mental health, is not psychological well-being. There's a study done by the University of Chicago during COVID, and they found that they said that during COVID, there was a significant drop in life satisfaction. It went down to 17% of Americans reporting that they were satisfied with life. And that was shocking to them. It's a very low number. But they said it was down considerably from previously reported numbers of 30 or 33%. And the shocking number they were highlighting is how significantly it dropped almost by half to 17%. What was more shocking to me is that 33% pre-COVID were not happy in the most economically prosperous nation that the world has ever seen. And so not all these people have a mental illness or mental disorder. We know that as psychologists, about 25% of individuals at most have a psychological disorder at any given one time. take a sample, at least in the Western world, typically in the United States. So what's going on with the other people that are reporting a lack of life satisfaction, or the going under the radar of subclinical disorder, subclinical kind of dissatisfaction? And so this is where focusing intentionally and building a connection between our spirituality and self-awareness and spiritual growth substantially increases psychological well-being and psychological resilience. If you want, we can kind of get in. I'll pause here for a moment. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but somebody may wonder, what does that look like? Because individual may say, so then is your prescription simply to just make 2 rakats when you're feeling depressed and move on with your life? Like, just do a little bit of dhikr and that's all your answer for all of your sort of psychological disorders and issues? Yes and no. That's an important part of it. But when we look at psychological well-being, and I'm not talking about serious mental disorder that may require professional help. If that's the case, that's an issue where you may need professional support. And we have a whole modality and model of an Islamically integrative approach to deal with mental disorder in a very specific, stage-wise process to help them get out of that situation. That's not a prescription or an approach that we take with just every individual. This is a special professional approach. But for people that are not necessarily in that mental disordered range, which is probably the majority of us, how do you create resilience against disorder, and how do you create greater sense of well-being and contentment in your life? We all struggle with this: anxieties, depressive feelings, relational issues, identity struggles, lethargy, habit formation, etc. The area of Islam that really deals with this a lot, and there's a spectrum, a continuum between mental disorders and psychological well-being, because and spirituality is infused within this, is character development. And character development, the Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, the Akhlaq literature that we find within the Islamic tradition, and they go into the virtues. If you go into the inculcation of the virtues. So I invite our listeners to really look into, actually I would invite them all to go to IslamicCharacter.com. IslamicCharacter.com is actually a inventory that we created, built off of a scale, sort of validated psychometrically to bring into the field of psychology. And it's built off of the Akhlaq al-Adudiyya of Aduddin al-Iji, 13th century scholar. And it takes his classification of the virtues, which, by the way, many people may not know what the virtues are. Like, we know about akhlaq, good akhlaq, being virtuous, but can we kind of list out how many of the virtues that we know? And many of them may be diluted by our misconceptions based upon our families or culture or social environments or settings and misconceptions that we have of them. I'll give you an example, if you don't mind. The concept of tawaddud is a virtue. Have you ever heard of this?
Is that to love someone else?
But did you know that it was a virtue under the category of like akhlaq?
No.
So I didn't know that myself either. I mean, despite the fact that I'm reading a lot of the character literature, I go into Akhlaq al-Adudiyya and I come under tawaddud. It's like, it's interesting. Piques my curiosity. I go under tawaddud, and essentially it is to give affection to people. Okay, I can understand that. The Prophet ﷺ says that if you love your brother, then tell him you love him. Sahabi comes and says to the Prophet ﷺ, I have 3 children, I don't kiss any of them, as if to show that he's like, very masculine macho man. And the Prophet ﷺ essentially says, paraphrase, like, it's not my problem that Allah Ta'ala has deprived you of mercy. This isn't necessarily a good thing, nor something to boast about. And so tawaddud, I can make sense of the fact of giving. What's very interesting is in the character manuals, they also say to ask for affection is part of the virtue. It's very interesting. Asking for affection. Now, many relationships, this is a solution to many relationship problems. Many relationships, people have different ways that they like to receive affection and love.
Yeah, the whole love language.
Yeah, love language, exactly. So the way that my wife likes to affection versus myself, or others, or my parents or siblings or whatnot, it's different, and we don't operate in the way that they do, and so we may not necessarily know how to give them what they need. And so to vocalize and verbalize your needs rather than holding it and becoming bitter and resentful when people don't necessarily meet your needs is a virtue. Isn't that incredible? Now, that serves as a protective factor. I have a student of mine working on a PhD dissertation where she's saying that marriage, what we do in marital therapy is often we teach individuals skills, problem solving, communication. There's a modality called IBCT, which is a kind of CBT's approach to marital therapy. And they have this concept of behavior exchange. Okay. Behavior exchange meaning I give you something, you give me something back. I give my spouse something, she gives me something back. So it's a negotiation. Yeah. And she's saying, look, the hypothesis is, and it's yet to be tested, that that learning skills and communication are necessary, but they're not sufficient to create lasting change in relationships and happiness and marital satisfaction. What we're missing is virtues. Think about hilm, forbearance, anger management, tawafuq, being compassionate with one another, or empathic, riqqa, or tawafuq is giving preference to others, being amenable, flexible. You're on a journey. Should we stop here? Sure, no problem. Let's eat this. Sure, no problem. You're not rigid. You're accommodating of others. Now, these are things, if we inculcate or attempt to inculcate these things, and our scholars in the character literature, they say, what we have to do is try to develop these virtues such that they go from being a state, a temporary state, to a permanent trait. From a state to a permanent trait. Meaning that they emerge automatically in a habituated manner without you needing to contemplate or think about it. 43% of human behavior is built off of, is governed by habits. When people think everyone's rational, everyone does everything rationally, built off of habits, 43% of them. So a lot of psychological well-being has to do with habituation of virtues, whether they be cognitive perspective, like positive orientation, negative attribution bias, positive attribution bias. I'll stop here because there's a lot that I could say on this whole notion, but there's emotional, there's behavioral, there's more pure spiritual, and you can see the virtues include ibadah, include tawakkul, they include tawaddud, they include rahmah and riqqa. They're so encompassing.
We have, I guess we just, it's just proof upon proof that we have such a rich history that can protect at least our community or Muslims around the world from this, I guess, pandemic of mental health issues that we are seeing, wreak havoc across the world. If we just come back to our tradition, which is unfortunately, absent in the Western world, in even academia. Like I don't remember a single module in high school that would teach you how to build your character. Yet it's so prevalent in our tradition, building our akhlaq, how to, better ourselves, how to have, all these character traits that you've mentioned. I want to move on to another study that I found, which is in fact the longest running study in the world, an 85-year-old Harvard study, which has set out to determine what determines people's level of happiness. And above all the different contributors to people's happiness, they found out that positive relationships sat at the very top of the list of contributing towards people's happiness. What does Islamic psychology have to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Positive relationships.
Absolutely. the Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha wa kunu ma'as sadiqin. O you who believe, fear Allah and be with those who are God conscious. The Prophet ﷺ says, Al-maru ala dini khalilihi falyandur ahadukum mimman yukhaliluh. A person is upon the deen of their, and the way of their khalil. Khalil is a close confidant. So all of you shall be mindful as to whom you take as your khalil. We have the Salatul Jummah. We have support networks. We have this concept of إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ. Like, reconcile between one another. I remember Imam Majid, actually, from the United States, we were having a conversation at a conference, and he had shared something very interesting with me that they do in Sudan. And he said, when there's a tension between two individuals, husband and wife or family members, what they do is they gather around, they go to the sheikh, and then the sheikh gathers a group of people, and they sit in a circle. They put these two people who are disputing with one another in front of each other. They serve tea, and then they start with like tilawa of Quran, and then the sheikh raises their hand and invites the congregation to make dua with him. He says, "Oh Allah, soften the hearts of these individuals, allow them to be forgiving, allow them to overlook their shortcomings, strengthen their bonds, etc." And then they finish. Then they come to the people, and then they say, "So, can you tell us what the problem is?" He says, by the time they come to the problem, the two parties are like, "I've forgiven the problem, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal." So the concept of support systems and networks becomes critically important. And this can be seen and manifested in so many different areas of our lives. Think about, so I advocate for like the kind of walking city, right? And there's Sheikh Fahad, for example, who was part of the kind of royal family in Qatar. He had taken us to his farm, Hinat Farms. I invite people to really go and check it out when they go to Doha. There's this really interesting vision and plan of creating this communal environment, of creating sort of well-being and natural sort of preservation of life. And unfortunately, in many Western cities or in many new industrial kind of metropolitan cities, you don't have much sense of community. Yep. People live in like nuclear families. Even if they live in proximity to individuals within a building, nobody knows one another. And so the concept of being able to walk outside, knowing your neighbors, connecting with individuals around you, having family, having support networks. I mean, isolation is one of the worst things that you can do to a human being. Yeah. There's a reason why they put people in solitary confinement, as it's one of the worst forms of punishment that you can give an individual. If they don't have companionship around them, they start to imagine it. So they start to hallucinate. It's actually an adaptive faculty that an individual starts to hallucinate because they don't have anyone to talk to. Right? So the socialization and connectedness and connectivity becomes an instrumental part of nurturing well-being. Yeah. And so certainly these studies are not uncommon. But you'll find a lot of the psychological well-being literature will make reference to positive relationships, meaning, right? Spirituality, even virtues. Positive psychology is interested in the virtues now. And they have a VIA kind of virtues or values in action inventory. And what I was referring to earlier, IslamicCharacter.com, people can go there. That's an inventory that we created. And you can actually fill it out. And then you'll get a report of your virtues.
How good you are.
What you need work on. You need to take that with a grain of salt because we're not suggesting that we're peering into your soul and identifying exactly what your virtues are, just for a tool to help you. And we're just, at the time for Ramadan, opportunity for individuals to really to take this opportunity to not just focus on the spiritual development, which is important. It's huququllah and huquq al-ibad. The rights of Allah and the rights of slaves, right? There is a person that came to, some people came to the Prophet ﷺ and they mentioned that there was a lady who was an abida. She would pray tahajjud during the night, fast during the day, something in Ramadan we're about to do. But she harms her others around her by with her tongue. She's sharp-tongued, sort of foul mouth. And he said about her, La khayra fiha, hiya min ahl an-nar, right? That there's no khayr in her, and she's from the people of Jahannam. Allah Ta'ala protect us from that. But there's a hadith, another hadith of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you know, ذهب صاحب حسن الخلق بخير الدنيا والآخرة. The person who has good character has taken off with the best of this dunya and the akhirah. Again, the relationship between the dunya and the akhirah, right? Like that in this dunya, people who live virtuous, they're happier. And another part of happiness and contentment, and this is what people are in the pursuit of, is you can't be in the pursuit of it. I mean, you can't be in the pursuit of pleasure and comfort. You have to be in the pleasure of contentment. Now, what's interesting about this is the more discomfort you embrace in life, the more comfortable you'll be. It seems counterintuitive. The more discomfort you embrace, the more comfortable you'll be. The more comfort you seek, the more uncomfortable you'll be. And this is kind of a given, almost a mujma alayh in psychology, among psychologists, a consensus that you can find across all the literature, that the more discomfort, uncomfortable, and you embrace the discomfort, more resilient and content and protected you will be. And this goes back to the process of your yesterday shouldn't be the same as today. A person's always kind of incrementally applying some more discomfort on themselves to make themselves better, right? And so psychological well-being is not about waiting for something bad to happen and fixing it, or facilitating a very comfortable environment for ourselves and then we'll feel happy. But it's actually being willing to go against the grain and embrace the discomforts very proactively, that prevents you from that protects you against a lot of these psychological disorders and dissatisfactions.
Wow, it's very powerful to like actually prepare yourselves, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promises us in the Quran that this life you will see hardship, you will see those difficult days, you will experience grief. On that point, how does one balance between the necessity of having to go through those difficult days, whether it's going through that phase of depression, going through that grief, and also understanding that this will ultimately bring me closer to Allah. So how do we reach that middle ground of accepting that, hey, this is hard, this is tough, this is going to perhaps even destroy me internally, but it's ultimately going to bring me closer to Allah? Yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize when I'm talking about putting oneself in discomfort or embracing the discomfort, I don't mean to suggest that one should wish hardship upon themselves either. Because, you know, we always ask for afiyah, that we hope that Allah Ta'ala doesn't try us. The best thing you could be given.
Exactly, is to be given afiyah. And so we ask for afiyah, but we psychologically prepare ourselves for the difficulties that are going to come. Many of the mashayikh and the philosopher physicians, they've labeled this world as the Darul Ibtila or Darul Ahzan, Darul Imtihan, the world of tests, the world of trials, the world of tribulations, the world of misery.
Wow.
It was interesting. Now, if you label it as such, then it changes your cognitive frame to realize that I should not be surprised by challenges. If a person goes to med school, or as you guys call it, uni over here,
University.
right?
We shorten everything in Australia.
Everything's like shortened, and you rub out the R's in a lot of words too, mashallah. So I'm still learning the language here, the lingo. So if a person thinks that they're going to go to grad school and pursue a PhD or a doctorate in something, and they're not going to get any tests, and then they get assigned a test, and then they say, why am I getting this test? This is not unreasonable. How is this happening? People would think that was strange, because it's a normal part of the process. So when you frame the dunya as Darul Ahzan, it gives you a new perspective by which to approach the world. I kind of, something sort of dawned upon me when I was just kind of meditating upon this notion of trials and tribulations, that it's as if we are at any given moment between a period of a trial, and then we reach some afiyah in between, some raha, some comfort in between. And it's like we're waiting for the next trial to hit us. If you think about it as the next trial is going to hit you, it's just a matter of time. And life goes from one period of a trial to another, to another, to another. That's going to be true across everything, whether it's your health, whether it's your wealth, whether it's your children, whether it's your relationships. And if we approach it with a degree of preparedness for the fact that those things are going to happen, and we don't sort of be surprised and broken and shaken by them, and that we prepare for those possibilities in advance, then that will give us a whole lot of resilience. So I don't know if that kind of answers.
No, definitely. I think if we embrace these challenges, these hardships with that level of expectation, it removes the disappointment factor, especially when we have all these high hopes in this world and it only ends up disappointing you. I guess you won't be disappointed in the first place.
Absolutely.
On that point, however, I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge the debilitating nature of experiencing depression on our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely.
The fact that it can distance you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just by the virtue of going through that depressive episode, it will, like, even in some instances, destroy your relationship with Allah. So how do we, I guess, remedy that?
Yeah. So there's a narration, a prophetic narration. Allah loves the broken heart, right? So while you're saying it can kind of break or cause a strain between you and the relationship between you and Allah Ta'ala, it may potentially even facilitate it. Sometimes individuals are given trials and tribulations that ends up creating transformative experiences in their lives, and it becomes an opportunity. So I don't want to frame it as the worst thing in the world, but framing it as a possibility and an opportunity for bouncing back and some growth, right, as well. It's important to understand that, like, depression can, and sometimes we don't understand how depression works, and depression can be categorized into kind of two different types of depression. One type of depression is one that's very biologically loaded, highly heritable, chronic, non-remitting, not very responsive to even psychotherapy. So not a lot of spiritual work is going to be helpful. I mean, it'll be helpful, but it won't necessarily get them out of it. Okay? It'll be supportive rather than sort of the treatment. And many people can feel a sense of shame that they, why am I in this slump? Why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't feel this way. I should be able to be better. And they just can't help it. This requires a lot of sabr, but also treatment. And I think this is where psychiatric medications in combination with psychotherapy becomes really critical and important.
On that point, sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but just to get some verification, because we've spoken a lot about the parallels between Islamic psychotherapy and modern psychology. We've spoken about, building traits, building characteristics that can prevent and protect you from ever experiencing these mental health negative feelings, right? Is there anything in our tradition that supports this aspect of depression that requires medication? Yes. Sorry, I'm not being like a conspiracy theorist or anything.
It's a very good question. Very valid question. Yeah, I mean, sometimes individuals think that these are kind of just exclusively sort of modern concepts, and individuals, have an aversion to the idea of any medication whatsoever. But we have to understand that within our tradition, there was never this sort of like false dichotomy between, medication and physical health, or biologically induced conditions, even if they be psychological and more spiritually, or what we call like psychological, environmental, thought, belief, emotional regulation-based kinds of issues. In fact, as early as like Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in his Risala, Masalih al-Anfus wal-Abdan, he talks about this. He says that and what I'm talking about is actually built from his model. And modern psychology supports this, but more on a spectrum rather than clean break between these two types. But individuals, for simplicity purposes, can think of depression that is more biologically loaded. And then there's depression that's more psychologically loaded.
Based on your circumstances, your environment.
Circumstances, environment, thoughts, perspective. Somebody who just got a divorce, somebody who lost their job, somebody who has a false notions, a very pessimistic person, poor support network, etc., that lands them into this depression, versus somebody who says, I have no reason to feel this way. I have good support networks around me, a lot of things to be grateful for, but I can't seem to shake this depression.
I
go to psychotherapy, it's not even helpful. And many people can feel very, even we call depression, depressed about being depressed.
Yes.
Right? And so Abu Zayd al-Bakhi says, look, there's that kind of depression, which is more endogenous, more biological, heritable. That requires psychiatric, medicinal-based sort of therapies. Versus the more psychological, exogenous, environmentally induced type of depression that requires the going to a hakim, the hikmah of the hakim, going essentially like what we would call today, they would call tabib or hakim, physician. And today we call them, psychotherapy, essentially. Going to psychology, talk therapy, right? Essentially is what we would call it. So this is found within our tradition. And if you go back to all of the writings of the philosopher physicians and the atibba, they always kind of break down, and of course they're using herbal types of medications, but that's what we've done is we've taken herbs and we've made them more potent and extracted the certain properties of them in order to increase their magnitude and power. That's really what modern medicine is. So that's why this kind of false dichotomy is not really all that useful. One thing that's contingent upon this bifurcation or this breakdown is what's very helpful is, sometimes the analogy that we use of the broken arm for the mental illness, it's not their fault. It has nothing to do with religion. They just need to go to a doctor and get treated. That only applies for the biologically based conditions. And so for that person, their sickness is a raf'u darajat or takfir sayyat, removal of their sins, elevation of their status, right? So patients, just like it was a cancer or a tumor or something like that in the way that they're dealing with it. The person who's this type of depression, this more exogenous environmental thought, this has a lot more to do with their lifestyle, their behaviors, their outlook on life. So this is intricately tied with Iman.
Wow.
So, sometimes people say, don't blame people. Iman has nothing to do with mental health. It's not because they have shortage of Iman.
It's a false dichotomy.
False dichotomy. It's not necessarily true because we do say the positive, right? On the positive, people say, if you pray more, it's a protective factor. If you pray more, you're more psychological well and more resilient and virtuous. Well, if the positive is true, then the negative is true as well, because there's certainly a relationship between spirituality and mental illness and mental health. But because of this other element, it starts to get confusing for people, so they don't like those associations. So we just need to get it right to say that, look, there's a biologically based type of thing that's not going to be very responsive to this. So this is the approach.
They're two separate.
And this is psychotherapy that's spiritually laden and infused in spirituality will facilitate mental healing and well-being. And it's not that we're blaming people. We're all struggling with stuff.
Definitely.
Iman isn't this like categorical, one thing. Well, you have it. Well, I'm Hanafi, so it is kind of categorical. But and I'm not talking about in that sense of the Aqidah sense, but like, what are the things associated with your increase and decrease of Iman? There's so many things associated with that.
I guess different people are at different levels, and therefore they will be rewarded accordingly, according to their own individual struggle, their own individual unique circumstances. I want to speak to you about religious trauma and its impact on one's religiosity, spirituality, and their mental health. Well, how prominent or prevalent have you witnessed religious trauma be in your practice, and what is the remedy for it so it doesn't affect their Iman? Yeah.
So trauma is a very good question. Religious trauma. So first of all, we need to kind of consider that not everybody who goes through a traumatic incident ends up having PTSD or trauma-based symptoms. It's kind of 16 or 17% on either side when you look at the bell curve. But majority of people are in the middle, which means that they don't feel good for a little while and then they recover.
Yeah, they have that resilience.
Yeah, they have resilience. They go back to normal. Then there's a segment, a group of them, a third, a smaller third. I'm not talking about proportionality. They're not 17% or so on this side, that experience trauma-based disorders. It could turn into some sort of depression, or anxiety disorders, or a PTSD or whatnot. And then you have people a little bit on the fence who are having kind of traumatic reactions to things, but not necessarily sick. But what's also very interesting is on the other side, you have what we call PTSG, which is post-traumatic growth.
Oh, wow.
You have individuals who are becoming resilient and better human beings as a result of experiencing certain traumas.
Wow.
Now, that's not to suggest that we go around prescribing traumas to people, but it's important to understand the spectrum that, sometimes we think, people are like, everybody who experiences a traumatic incident is going to experience a trauma-based reaction. But it does happen, right? It's certainly a good proportion of individuals who may have experienced trauma, and trauma is very prevalent in mental disorders, even if it's not PTSD. It may be the underlying kind of features of other disorders. And people will have very strong aversions and reactions to certain things, like going to the masjid or ta'aleem or reading and study. And even this podcast possibly can be triggering for people. You become triggered very easily, right? Those things as a result, and because they get wired with a degree of emotional intensity. And so whenever they do get triggered, right, that emotional intensity brings it all back. And it could be familiar smells, familiar sights, familiar places. Like the masjid has that familiarity to it. Religious people have a familiarity to it. And I guess that's why it's also really important to, for us as psychologists, we advocate for this, is that not every person who's coming in with a religious question is to be given a religious answer or a intellectual or rational kind of response, because the question may not be arising out of a rational dilemma. I believe the majority of individuals who are struggling with faith are not struggling with it because of some irreconcilable inconsistency or logical issue or some sort of like academic issue, because really, alhamdulillah, Allah Ta'ala has made this religion so perfect that it's beyond being able to describe how incredible we're able to really reconcile between reason and science and faith and theology and spirituality. Everything is just so perfectly situated in harmony with one another.
So it would be like an emotional
reaction. Yeah, and we call these critical life experiences. Critical life experiences impact people whether they be positive or negative. Negative experiences, and this will affect their virtues as well.
So I guess separating that layer, or I guess separating the equation from this has nothing to do with your religion, more so like this is an experience, a personal experience that you could be reacting to. Yeah, parataxic distortions we call them, or projections or displacement. So there are many terms that we use to say that an individual is essentially taking something in the present that is triggering a strong emotional reaction to something in the past. And we call these maladaptive emotions, meaning not healthy emotions, because once upon a time they were useful, but in the present they're not. So many people are walking around as wounded people. And the whole issue of like ultra-liberalism and the trigger ってand whatnot. And what we're doing to such people who are wounded is that we are baby-proofing our entire environments for them. Watch out from this microaggression and this trigger over here. Instead of helping heal people. And actually the treatment to trauma is exposure, by the way, right? You expose an individual to the very things that they're afraid of, or discuss and process through the very things that they're concerned with, to come out stronger and resilient and to
cure and heal those traumatic reactions.
You reminded me of our recent visit to Syria. So we just came back from Syria
mashallah,
last
really?
month. And obviously it was a deeply traumatic place for millions upon millions of Syrians that witnessed severe displacement, bombardment, destruction. And we were accompanying a prisoner, a female ex-prisoner of one of Assad's dungeons.
Wow.
And she wanted to heal herself by going to the prison. I was like, what? You want to go to the...
Wow.
She wanted to go to the prison. And I felt like it comes back to that exposure. Go back to the place where you experience the trauma. I'm not giving any prescription, guys. But I'm saying like this is what she wanted to do.
Sure.
Go back to the place where she experienced the trauma
and
tell herself that I am bigger than this place.
Wow.
I am bigger than this dungeon. And she came out like very much more powerful and more resilient. So
that's incredible.
It goes back to what you're saying.
It's incredible. Subhanallah. Incredible. Wow. That's beautiful. MashaAllah.
Jazakallah khairan for that. On the topic of this, people dealing with trauma and all these negative feelings, I think there's another problem of negative self-talk whereby people internally just speak down to themselves, think bad of themselves, think bad even of their relationship with Allah and Allah's perception of them as individuals. How prevalent is this? And again, what is the remedy for negative self-talk?
Yeah, good. So we all have this mechanism for self-criticism. We have this internal critic. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, al-wa'idhu fi qalbi kulli muslim. A wa'id, a reminder, a reprimander that's in the heart of every Muslim. And nafs al-lawama, right? The blaming self, okay? And I was just reading actually about the nafs al-lawama and is it only seen through the lens of the positive, or is it possible that this blaming self can overdo it? And I recently stumbled upon some discussions of it in some contemporary, scholarly discussions of it, and it seems to be that they go both ways, and that there seems to be, precedence for even classical scholars having this position. So what does this tell us? First of all, what's the function of the critic? The function of the critic is to hold you. It's a self-regulatory system to hold you responsible for your values. Okay? So if you miss prayer and salah, then what happens is the critical self blames you and says you shouldn't miss salah. You should be ashamed of yourself. And it shames you. So it induces shame, which can eventually, by the way, if it's too powerful and strong, can lead to depression. Okay? So shame is a very common issue that underlies clinical depression. So because it generates hopelessness, and hopelessness is tied to depression. So you tell yourself, so it goes from blaming the action, if it's unhealthy, the maladaptive.
So there is a healthy shame. We need to make that very clear. Yes. Absolutely.
This is where the problem is that people sometimes go to the other extreme and they say, nobody should criticize me. Everybody, in modern psychology, what people used to do in my clinical training, they used to say, look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself you're wonderful, you're beautiful, love yourself. Exactly. One time I was sitting around in clinical training, I was talking about, some experiences, and they were saying, and then the facilitator, was my clinical supervisor, says, tell yourself you are perfect. Tell yourself you are competent.
It's like shirk.
It's like, what? No. And he's like, it's okay. Like, it's okay to do it. Just do it. Like, tell yourself you love yourself. It's like, no, I'm not going to do that, right? Wow. So we go to this weird extreme on the other side. And why do people do that? Because they just don't know what to do with the other extreme. So we create a society by which nobody should criticize us. Everyone should accept us the way that we are. It's problematic. So there's a process by which we criticize ourselves to hold us responsible for our values, goals, actions. That's healthy. Shame is adaptive in so much as it gets you to correct your behavior that was pathological and wrong, and to fix it. Just like in Tawbah. In Tawbah, you need to do i'tiraf. You need to acknowledge your sin. and make it feel the guilt, nadama, feel the shame, the disgust with yourself for doing this. Turn to Allah and make a vow and pledge never to return to it again.
Yes.
Right? So that's adaptive shame. But too much of it, where we go from you miss salah, you should be ashamed of yourself, you should never miss it again, you'll be punished for this, you better make tawbah and make a sincere vow never to do this again, to you are useless and you're a bad Muslim, you're going to hell, there's no hope for you. That's a critical voice that's not helpful, right? And so that kind of critical voice leads you to yes or hopelessness. It actually makes you feel worse about yourself, and it doesn't actually help you correct yourself. You just feel worse about what you did, but you're unable to actually do anything about it. So that kind of critical voice is highly problematic. Then there's another element of the criticism is where we're concerned with social perceptions of others, of us. People will think that I'm not good enough. People will think that I'm useless. People will think that I'm, like, to a degree, like I felt this coming into this podcast. MashaAllah, you guys have a big following and audience, and you know, and it's like
no need to be intimidated.
Yeah, so
whoever benefits.
I should probably look at myself in the mirror and tell myself I'm wonderful, right? But I didn't use that remedy before coming here. But what I did instead is that you tell yourself that at the end of the day, I need to try to exit the perceptions of others around of me. How does Allah see me?
Wow.
And if I can relate that to how Allah sees me, then inshallah ta'ala, irrespective of how others see me, then I'm good. And I'm not saying you dismiss social feedback altogether, but you take it as constructive criticism. So somebody tells you, I don't know, let's say after this example, you gave me a feedback and you said, you know, you kind of get into too much technical, academic, philosophical stuff. You maybe be better to be a little bit practical. That's good, useful, constructive criticism for myself. Why? Because it's consistent with my intention of giving things tangible and palatable information to be useful. It's not, this isn't just an entertaining kind of experience of philosophizing of something for the sake of philosophy. And so that's good criticism. But if you came to me and you said, you know, I think you could use a little bit more jokes and be a little bit more entertaining, make people laugh a little bit, I'd be like, I don't really care for that criticism because I'm not a comedian. You know, that's not why I'm here.
Awesome.
Right.
On that point of, you know, gaining your validation and your sense of self-worth from looking towards what Allah sees from you as opposed to what the people see from you. There's a very powerful hadith where the Prophet ﷺ teaches us hadith Qudsi, whereby Allah says, Ana 'inda dhanni 'abdi bi. I am as my servant perceives me. There's a problem, however, when the servant perceives Allah as, you know, not liking me, not being pleased with me. So then it kind of becomes like this cyclical problem where, all right, I don't think Allah is pleased with me, therefore Allah is not pleased with me. According to the hadith. So how do we balance this out?
No, you pointed out something very powerful. And this is a concept of like having husna dhan ma'Allah. You have husna dhan with people, positive attribution of behaviors to people and giving excuses to people for what they do. But also husna dhan ma'Allah, like perceiving Allah through a lens of positivity. What does this look like? I mean, it's important to consider this is not simply a perceptual exercise, a psychological exercise to delude yourself and to make yourself feel good. This actually is spiritually effective. It's a spiritual intervention. So we believe that Allah Ta'ala is all merciful and He loves for people to rely on the mercy, on His sifat, His attributes of mercy. And the more we call upon those attributes of His mercy, the more He rains those showers the mercy upon us. Right? And so there's a powerful, hadith in which an individual comes on Yawm al-Qiyamah in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah ta'ala gives His judgment and says, this person is going to Jahannam. And the angels are dragging him off to Jahannam. And while he's being dragged off, he turns and he says, oh Allah, I didn't expect this. He's shocked. He says, bring him back. What is it that you expected? said, I expected you to forgive me. You're all merciful, forgiving, sattar, overlooking. I expected that you would overlook my sins. Your mercy overcomes your wrath. And Allah Ta'ala says, I've forgiven him, send him to Jannah. So what I'm saying is that husn dhan ma'Allah is a powerful spiritual act. And, in waswasa treatment, for example, what we do, people are always consumed with the fear of being punished.
Yeah.
And if you go into all of the possibilities of things that we may have done, and think about it, we could think about it ourselves, of all of the prayers that we've prayed, all of the wudu that we've made, we would probably safely say that 3 to 10% of them, we may have not even known broken wudu, broken our salah. We don't even realize it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even remember it. And so are we going to be punished for that? Inshallah not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If Allah deals with us through his justice, he will. But nobody will enter into Jannah except with the mercy of Allah. So relying on the mercy of Allah and calling up, sometimes we tell our patients to change the way that they make dua instead of a fear-based orientation to more of a mercy and drawing and doing jalb, of trying to draw the or jadb of the mercy of Allah Ta'ala, trying to bring the mercy of Allah Ta'ala over us.
That's very beautiful.
Yeah.
It's been a beautiful conversation thus far. I think if we can end on some practical advice for our listeners. A lot of this conversation has been about helping ourselves and helping others, helping those around us in our communities, those who are going through difficult times. If you could just perhaps, I don't know if this is something we could discuss, but what are some of the practical things to look out for if someone's not doing well, whether in ourselves or in those around us, so that we can help people? Yeah.
I think number one, it would be important for individuals to engage in a lot of self-awareness. Take the inventory on the website. Be very reflective, especially during the month of Ramadan. This opportunity to really turn our eyes inwards. Take some time for khalwa. Disconnect from everything around us, from your technology, from your media, from everything. And so that's, of course you have your time for that, but take some time for disconnecting to really get to know yourself, and then make a very structured plan for yourself as to what are the goals that I want to work on. Personal development, psychological and spiritual development. We make very tangible plans for academic lives of which degrees and courses and whatnot we need to take in order to get into certain programs and get into certain fields. We quantify them even into numbers. But we don't necessarily, we do that with business or economics. We don't necessarily do that with our spirituality. And spirituality and character and virtue development is not something that necessarily comes by default. It comes with development. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi also says this in his Risala. He says physical illnesses, psychological illnesses are much more prevalent than physical illnesses, because we're always in an emotional influx. We're always getting thrown from one thing to another. We're always in situations that elevate and throw us off of i'tidal, off our balance. So you need to take proactive approaches to develop this muscle. It says it doesn't happen naturally like physical health. Physical health, you eat organic, you eat greens, you eat, don't go crazy on sweets, do what your body tells you to do, you should be fine. Psychological resilience is something that is proactively generated. Spiritual well-being is something that's proactively generated. As the scholars say, it's something that starts with a bit takalluf, ibtida'an, with difficulty in the beginning, لِتَسِيرُ عَادَةً فِي النِّهَايَةِ, or something of that sort, so that it becomes a habit by the end. It happens with a lot of exertion at the beginning in order to become a habit in the end. So really taking the time during the month of Ramadan to have self-awareness, draw up maybe one trait that I want to develop or characteristic that I want to work on and develop. Could be a vice, and then I want to develop the virtue instead of it. like anger management, or develop hilm. And over the month of Ramadan, week 1, I'm going to be silent. Week 2, I'm going to respond to criticisms from others with empathy. First silence. Week 2, it's silence and then empathy. Week 3 is idfa' billati hiya ahsan. Do something kind for them, in fact. So it could be tadrijan, right? It's a process of gradual process of growth. So do that which you can handle, as the Prophet ﷺ says. خُذُوا مِنَ الْأَعْمَالِ مَا تُطِيقُونَ. Do that which you have the capacity to do. Don't overburden and overwhelm yourself, but do it gradually such that it becomes a habit, that becomes a trait embedded within your heart, inshallah. And I'll ask Allah Ta'ala to give us tawfiq to be able to do this for ourselves, for our children, and for those around us, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hooman. You've left us with so much to take on board, to implement within our daily lives, inshallah, to improve our well-being and also the well-being of those around us in our communities. And I thank you once again. Thank you so much to our listeners abroad. I hope you found much benefit in this discussion. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.